What if I told you that the creatures haunting your childhood bedtime stories were never meant for children at all? What if those innocent fairy tales you grew up with were actually sanitized versions of something far darker, far more complex, and infinitely more fascinating than anything Disney could ever imagine? Picture this: goblins that didn't just steal cookies from your kitchen, but served as cosmic agents of justice. Fairies who weren't tiny, sparkly wish-granters, but towering beings of terrifying beauty, who could curse you with a glance. Elves who weren't jolly toy makers or ethereal forest dwellers, but divine entities once worshipped as gods. And spirits, oh the spirits, beings so powerful that entire civilizations built their moral frameworks around appeasing them. Tonight, we're about to embark on a journey that will shatter everything you think you know about folklore. We're diving deep into the shadowy origins of humanity's most enduring mythological beings, uncovering truths that have been buried beneath centuries of cultural sanitization, religious suppression, and commercial exploitation. Because here's what they don't want you to know. These weren't just stories. They were survival guides, moral compasses, windows into civilizations that understood something about the world that we've forgotten. Something about the thin veil between the seen and unseen, between order and chaos, between the human world and something far more ancient and mysterious. So prepare yourself. What you're about to discover will change not just how you see folklore, but how you understand the very fabric of human consciousness itself. Because some stories, as you're about to learn, are too powerful to die. Let me start with a question that might disturb you. What if goblins were never the bumbling green-skinned creatures you see in video games and fantasy movies? What if they were something far more sophisticated, moral enforcers in a universe where justice operated on principles we've long forgotten? The word goblin carries weight that most people never realize. When it first appeared in 14th century France as goblin, it wasn't describing some harmless woodland sprite. The term derives from the Latin goblinus and the Greek kobalos, both meaning rogue or knave. But here's where it gets fascinating. That same Greek root kobalos also gives us the word cobalt, connecting goblins to the very metals hidden deep in the earth. This isn't coincidence. Ancient peoples understood something we've lost: the connection between the mineral world and the spirit realm. German miners spoke in hushed tones of kobolds, underground spirits who could lead you to veins of precious metal or cause catastrophic cave-in. These weren't cartoon characters. They were forces of nature personified, beings who demanded respect, offerings, and above all, humility. Travel across medieval Europe and you'll find goblins everywhere, but not as enemies to be slaughtered for experience points. In England, the hobgoblin represented something psychologically profound: the helper who becomes the tormentor when disrespected. Shakespeare's Puck wasn't comic relief. He was the embodiment of nature's unpredictability, a mirror reflecting human folly back at us with cosmic irony. Consider the English hobgoblin's most telling characteristic. It would help with household chores, tirelessly working through the night, asking for nothing but basic respect in return. But the moment you tried to spy on it, to pierce the veil of mystery, it would vanish forever. Or worse, turn vengeful. This isn't just superstition, it's sophisticated psychology wrapped in folklore. These stories taught people about boundaries, about the importance of gratitude without entitlement, about accepting help without demanding control. In Germany, the cobalt spirits haunted minds with a moral complexity that should make us question our simplistic view of good and evil. These beings would guide deserving miners to gold, but punish greed with disasters. They embodied the principle that the earth's treasures weren't free for the taking. They required spiritual negotiation, respect for forces beyond human understanding. Scandinavia gave us the Nis, perhaps the most psychologically sophisticated goblin variant. Wearing his distinctive red cap, this farm guardian would protect livestock and help with chores, but his temperament was legendary. Forget to leave him porridge on Christmas Eve, and you'd wake to find your animals sickened, your tools missing, your careful preparations destroyed. But this wasn't petty vengeance. It was a cultural teaching about reciprocity, about maintaining balance between the human and natural world. Here's what modern fantasy gets completely wrong about goblins. They were never random antagonists. They were agents of a cosmic justice system that operated on principles far more sophisticated than our current legal frameworks. In a world where scientific explanation didn't exist for natural disasters, illness, or sudden misfortune, goblins provided a moral framework that made sense of chaos. Your crops failed, perhaps you'd been stingy with offerings. Your tools kept breaking, maybe you'd shown disrespect to the invisible forces that shared your world. Your animals fell sick, time to examine whether you'd been living according to the values your community held sacred. This isn't primitive thinking, it's brilliant social engineering. Goblin folklore created a world where moral behavior had tangible consequences, where every action rippled through both visible and invisible realms. They were the enforcement mechanism for societies that understood something we've lost, that human behavior affects forces beyond what we can see or measure. What fascinates me most about goblins is their affinity for threshold spaces, caves, forests, abandoned buildings, crossroads. The spaces between spaces. They don't just live in these places. They are these places, embodied. Folklore consistently places goblins at boundaries, between day and night, between seasons, between the human world and something else entirely. This reveals something profound about the human psyche. Goblins represent our uncomfortable relationship with transition, with uncertainty, with the spaces where normal rules don't apply. They're attracted to doors, bridges, tunnels, anywhere that connects one state of being to another. In psychological terms, they're manifestations of our anxiety about liminal spaces, about moments when we're neither here nor there, when we're vulnerable to forces beyond our control. But they're also guardians of these spaces, which suggests that our ancestors understood something crucial. Transformation always comes with risk, and wisdom lies in respecting the powers that govern change. The connection between goblins and children in traditional folklore isn't accidental. It's deeply psychological. Parents across Europe used goblin stories to teach complex moral lessons that abstract rules couldn't convey. Don't go into the forest, becomes the goblins will take you. Don't be greedy becomes goblins curse those who steal. But look deeper, and you'll find something more sophisticated. Goblin stories often involved children who were taken to otherworldly realms and returned changed, if they returned at all. These weren't just cautionary tales about stranger danger. They were metaphors for the psychological transformation that childhood itself represents. The child who wanders into goblin territory and returns is never quite the same, having seen behind the veil of ordinary reality. In Welsh folklore, goblins didn't just steal naughty children, they stole children who had lost their innocence, who had begun to see the world as adults do in terms of exploitation rather than wonder. The goblin realm became a metaphor for the space between childhood and adulthood, a dangerous but necessary passage where one's fundamental relationship with reality is transformed. When Christianity spread across Europe, something tragic happened to goblins. These complex moral entities were flattened into demons, their sophisticated symbolic functions reduced to simple evil. Medieval demonology classified them as minor devils, servants of Satan sent to tempt humans into sin. This wasn't just religious reform, it was cultural lobotomy. The rich psychological and moral complexity of goblin folklore was stripped away, replaced by a crude dualism that could only see good and evil, saved and damned. The goblin's role as a teacher, as a force that challenged humans to examine their own moral behavior, was lost. What we lost in this transformation was immense. We lost a sophisticated understanding of moral complexity, of the importance of respect for invisible forces, of the need for humility in the face of powers beyond our comprehension. We traded psychological sophistication for theological simplicity, and our understanding of the world became impoverished as a result. Today, goblins have been thoroughly domesticated. Video games present them as low-level enemies to be slaughtered en masse. Fantasy novels reduce them to comic relief or generic monsters. We've taken beings that once represented cosmic justice and moral complexity and turned them into experience points and merchandise. But something interesting is happening in contemporary culture. The most sophisticated modern portrayals of goblins, in works like Pan's Labyrinth, the Spiderwick Chronicles, or certain video games that treat them with complexity, are rediscovering their original symbolic power. These works understand that goblins represent something essential: our need for moral accountability, our fear of chaos, our hunger for justice in an unjust world. The goblin endures not because it's a good monster design, but because it speaks to something eternal in human psychology. As long as we struggle with moral complexity, as long as we fear the consequences of our actions, as long as we sense invisible forces operating beyond our control, the goblin archetype will persist, waiting in the shadows of our consciousness, ready to teach us what we've forgotten about respect, humility, and the price of wisdom. If goblins have been misunderstood, fairies have been utterly butchered by modern culture. What we've done to the fairy archetype is nothing short of cultural vandalism. We've taken beings that once represented the awesome, terrible power of nature itself, and reduced them to tiny, glittering wish-granters with butterfly wings. Let me shatter that illusion right now. The word fairy comes from the Old French fairy, which didn't refer to the beings themselves but to their realm, a parallel dimension of power and magic called la fairy. The Latin root fatum, meaning fate, tells us everything we need to know about their true nature. These weren't helpful spirits, they were embodiments of destiny itself, beings who could alter the fundamental trajectory of human lives with a glance, a word, a whim. Traditional fairies weren't tiny. They were often human-sized or larger, possessed of an alien beauty that could literally hypnotize mortals. Their charm wasn't cute, it was weaponized. Their songs didn't grant wishes. They lured travelers into eternal sleep. Their feasts weren't celebrations. They were traps that could bind a human soul for centuries. But here's what's most important to understand. Fairies operated by their own moral code, one that was completely alien to human ethics. What seemed like kindness to a fairy might destroy a human life. What appeared to be cruelty might actually be a profound gift. They existed in a moral universe, where human concepts of good and evil simply didn't apply. Central to understanding fairies is grasping the concept of the other world, the parallel realm where they dwell. This wasn't just a different place, it was a different kind of reality altogether, where the normal rules of physics, time and causality, simply didn't function. The other world could be accessed through specific locations, stone circles, burial mounds, ancient forests, certain lakes, but only at particular times. Beltane and Samhain, the Celtic festivals marking seasonal transitions, were when the veil between worlds grew thin enough for crossing. But time flowed differently there. A night spent dancing with fairies might mean decades had passed in the human world. Lovers would return to find their sweethearts aged and married, their children grown, their own lives reduced to legend. This temporal displacement wasn't arbitrary cruelty. It was a profound metaphor for the transformative nature of certain experiences. Anyone who has undergone intense spiritual transformation, trauma, or revelation knows the feeling. Time stops, reality shifts, and when you return to ordinary consciousness, the world has somehow fundamentally changed. The fairy realm was a mythological way of describing these liminal states of consciousness. What's remarkable about fairy-like beings is their universality. While the Celtic world gave us the most elaborate fairy mythology, similar entities appear across cultures with striking consistency. Norse mythology speaks of the Alfar, radiant beings of light connected to fertility, death, and the mysteries of existence. These weren't woodland sprites, they were divine entities worthy of worship and propitiation. Archaeological evidence shows that offerings were made to elves at burial sites, suggesting their connection to the afterlife and the transformation of souls. Slavic Rusaka were spirits of drowned women who could lure men to watery deaths with their song. But they weren't simply malevolent, they represented the dangerous beauty of nature itself, the way water can both nourish and destroy, the way feminine power can both create and annihilate. Greek nymphs were divine spirits embodying natural features, trees, rivers, mountains. They were immortal, beautiful, and utterly indifferent to human moral categories. A nymph might bless a respectful worshipper with prosperity, or drive a presumptuous mortal to madness, for the crime of seeing her naked. Their beauty was sacred, terrible, and absolutely not for human consumption. Japanese yokai like the kitsune demonstrate the same pattern, beings of supernatural beauty and power who interact with humans according to incomprehensible rules. A kitsune might serve as a devoted wife for decades, only to vanish without explanation when some invisible taboo is broken. They loved, but not as humans love. They rewarded but not as humans understand reward. Perhaps the most psychologically sophisticated aspect of fairy folklore is the concept of fairy gifts. Blessings that always come with hidden costs. Fairy gold that turns to leaves by morning. Supernatural beauty that fades at the stroke of midnight. Magical abilities that exact a terrible price from their users. The story of Thomas the Rhymer perfectly illustrates this principle. Taken by the fairy queen, he's given the gift of prophecy, but can never lie again. Sounds like a blessing, right? But imagine living in a world where you must always speak uncomfortable truths, where diplomatic silence becomes impossible, where the social lubrication of small lies is denied to you. Thomas received exactly what he asked for, but the fairy queen understood the true cost in ways he never could. This reflects something profound about the nature of power itself. True power always comes with sacrifice. Real transformation always involves loss. Fairy gifts taught people to think carefully about what they truly wanted, because they might actually get it, along with consequences they never imagined. No aspect of fairy folklore is darker or more tragic than the changeling tradition. The belief that fairies would steal human babies and leave their own sickly offspring in their place led to horrific practices throughout medieval Europe. Children who seemed different, whether through illness, developmental disabilities, or simply unusual behavior, were sometimes subjected to brutal tests to determine if they were changelings. But beneath this horror lies something psychologically fascinating. The changeling myth was an attempt to process the incomprehensible. Why do some children suffer? Why do babies die? Why do some develop differently than others? In a world without medical science, fairy abduction provided an explanation that preserved parental love while acknowledging unbearable reality. The changeling story also reveals deep anxieties about identity and belonging. The fear that your child might not truly be yours, that the person you love might be somehow alien, touches on fundamental insecurities about recognition, love, and family bonds. It's no accident that changeling stories persist in modern horror and science fiction. They tap into primal fears about the authenticity of our most intimate relationships. Fairies weren't random in their behavior. They followed strict rules, and humans who understood these rules could navigate fairy encounters safely. But these rules often contradicted human instincts and social norms, creating situations where good intentions led to disaster. Never eat fairy food, for it would bind you to their realm forever. The temptation of otherworldly sustenance, more delicious than anything earthly, represented the allure of experiences that seem transcendent but prove imprisoning. How many addictions? How many destructive relationships? How many toxic situations begin with something that seems like nourishment but proves to be bondage? Never step inside a fairy ring, those circles of mushrooms or unusual grass that marked places where fairies dance. Cross that threshold, and you might be trapped in time, forced to dance until you died of exhaustion. The fairy ring represents boundaries we shouldn't cross, experiences we shouldn't pursue, knowledge we're not ready to handle. Never thank a fairy directly, for gratitude was considered binding or insulting. This seemingly counterintuitive rule taught something profound about the nature of gift-giving. True gifts come without obligation. Genuine generosity expects no gratitude. By making thanks taboo, fairy folklore suggested that the highest forms of exchange transcend human social conventions. When Christianity encountered fairy beliefs, something complex happened. Rather than simply destroying these traditions, early Christian theologians developed elaborate explanations for fairy existence within their cosmological framework. Fairies were often described as angels who refused to choose sides in Lucifer's rebellion, neither good nor evil, condemned to exist in liminal spaces until the end of time. This theological creativity preserved fairy traditions while transforming their meaning. Fairies became symbols of spiritual neutrality, beings who existed outside the salvation economy that defined Christian existence. They represented the possibility of supernatural power that wasn't aligned with either divine or demonic forces. A deeply unsettling concept in a dualistic religious worldview. Some Christian traditions went further, suggesting that fairies were the souls of unbaptized children, or people who had died before Christianity reached their lands. This created a poignant mythology where fairies embodied spiritual uncertainty, beings caught between worlds through no fault of their own. The Victorian era committed perhaps the greatest crime against fairy folklore in history. They made fairies cute. Influenced by romantic poetry, children's literature, and a sanitized view of the past, Victorian culture transformed dangerous alien beings into flower-dwelling miniatures with gossamer wings. This wasn't innocent adaptation, it was cultural lobotomy. The psychological sophistication of fairy folklore, its complex exploration of power, transformation, and moral ambiguity, was stripped away and replaced with saccharine sentimentality. Fairies became acceptable for children's bedrooms, their terrible beauty reduced to glittery decoration. The damage was immense. We lost a sophisticated understanding of how power operates, how beauty can be dangerous, how gifts come with costs, how the otherworldly intersects with ordinary reality. We traded psychological depth for commercial appeal, and our culture became impoverished as a result. Something interesting is happening in contemporary culture. The most sophisticated modern portrayals of fairies in works like Pan's Labyrinth, the Witcher series, Holly Black's Folk of the Air books, or Neil Gaiman's urban fantasy, are rediscovering their original power. These works understand that fairies represent something essential, the dangerous beauty of the natural world, the alien logic of power structures beyond human comprehension, the terrible price of transcendent experience. Modern fairy stories often focus on glamour. Not just magical illusion, but the way beauty and power can mask predatory intentions. They explore the economics of supernatural exchange, the way otherworldly beings operate by rules that make human morality irrelevant. They understand that true fairy encounters transform the human participant irrevocably, usually in ways that are neither wholly beneficial nor entirely destructive. Fairies endure because they represent something eternal in human experience. Our complicated relationship with beauty, power, and transformation. They embody our fascination with the otherworldly and our terror of losing ourselves in. They represent the seductive danger of experiences that promise transcendence but may cost us our humanity. In a world where we're constantly bombarded with images of sanitized beauty, where power operates through increasingly complex and invisible mechanisms, where transformation is promised through consumption and technology, the original fairy archetype offers something our souls recognize, the truth that real power is alien, real beauty is dangerous, and real transformation always comes with a price we can't fully calculate in advance. The fairy teaches us to approach the numinous with proper respect, to understand that some gifts are too costly to accept, and to remember that the most beautiful things in existence may be the most dangerous. In our glittering superficial age, we need the fairies' terrible wisdom more than ever. If you think the transformation of fairies has been dramatic, wait until you hear what happened to elves. We're talking about beings who went from being worshipped as gods in ancient Norse cosmology to making toys in Santa's workshop. This isn't just folklore evolution, it's one of the most complete inversions of meaning in the entire history of mythology. Let's start with a truth that will fundamentally alter how you see elves in ancient Norse mythology. The Alfar weren't just magical beings, they were divine entities worthy of worship, sacrifice, and temple offering. The Prose Edda describes them as radiant beings of light dwelling in Alfheim, one of the 9 worlds of Norse cosmology, a realm given as a tooth gift to the fertility god Freyr. But here's where it gets fascinating. Archaeological evidence from Scandinavia shows elf worship wasn't metaphorical. Actual temples called Alfa Blot were built for elf worship. Burial sites contain offerings specifically intended for elves. Ancient legal documents reference Alfadir, elf sacred lands that couldn't be settled or farmed. We're talking about beings so powerful, so revered, that entire legal and religious systems developed around appeasing them. The Eljas Alfar, or light elves, were associated with divine radiance, creativity, fertility, and the life force itself. They weren't just good guys, they were cosmic principles embodied. The Dukakalfar, or dark elves, controlled the underworld forces of death, transformation, and hidden knowledge. Some scholars argue they were identical to dwarves, master craftsmen, who forged the gods' most powerful artifacts. Think about what this means. Elves were once considered so essential to cosmic function that the gods themselves depended on their skills and intercession. They weren't servants or subjects. They were partners in maintaining universal order. As Norse culture spread into Anglo-Saxon Britain, something interesting happened to elf mythology. They retained their power but became increasingly ambiguous morally. Old English texts reference elfsine, elf beautiful, elfsine, elf kind, and most tellingly elfsagada, elf sickness, mysterious ailments attributed to elven influence. The concept of elf sot becomes central here. Sudden, unexplainable illnesses were attributed to invisible arrows fired by elves. But this wasn't random malevolence, it was believed to be punishment for moral transgressions, environmental disrespect, or breaking ancient taboos. Anglo-Saxon medical texts contain elaborate charms and remedies for elf sot, treating it as seriously as any physical ailment. Personal names like Alfric, elf power, elf word, elf guardian, and Alfred, elf counsel, suggest that despite their dangerous reputation, elves retained associations with wisdom, protection, and divine authority. Parents named their children after elves because they wanted to invoke that power, even if they feared it. The Christianization of Europe marked a catastrophic transformation in elf mythology. Beings who had once been worshipped as gods were systematically demonized, reduced to dangerous spirits at best, servants of Satan at worst. Medieval texts describe elves as fallen angels, demons in disguise, or souls of the unbaptized dead. But the transition wasn't immediate or complete. Early Christian texts show fascinating theological creativity as writers tried to incorporate elf beliefs into their new cosmological framework. Some described elves as angels who refused to choose sides in Lucifer's rebellion, condemned to exist in liminal spaces until Judgment Day. Others suggested they were the souls of people who died before Christianity reached their lands, spiritually neutral beings caught between salvation and damnation. This theological flexibility preserved elf traditions while transforming their meaning. Church documents from medieval Scotland reference elf crosses, Christian symbols designed to protect against elven influence. Holy water was blessed specifically for anti-elf purposes. The Church didn't deny elven existence, it repositioned elves within Christian spiritual warfare. What's remarkable is how completely this transformation succeeded. Within a few centuries, beings who had been worshipped in temples were relegated to folk superstition and children's stories. The divine Alfar became nursery bogeymen, their cosmic significance erased from cultural memory. Throughout European folklore, elves maintained their connection to otherworldly realms. They dwelt in hollow hills, ancient mounds, sacred groves, and stone circles, liminal spaces where the barriers between worlds grew thin. These weren't just hiding places, they were cosmic boundaries, and elves were their guardians. The timing of elven appearances was significant. They were most active during seasonal transitions. Beltane, midsummer, Samhain, when the natural world itself was transformed. They danced under the full moon, their movements said to influence fertility, weather, and the health of crops and livestock. Time flowed differently in elven realms. Mortals who joined their dances might experience a single night that lasted years in human time. This temporal displacement wasn't magical whimsy, it was a sophisticated metaphor for transformative experiences that alter consciousness so profoundly that normal time seems to stop. Consider the psychological accuracy of this. Anyone who has undergone intense spiritual experience, profound trauma, or deep revelation knows that subjective time can become completely disconnected from clock time. The elven otherworld was a mythological representation of altered states of consciousness. Experiences so transformative that participants returned fundamentally changed. The 18th and 19th centuries brought a romantic revival of folklore that began to rehabilitate elves, but it was J. Tolkien who fundamentally transformed their modern image. Drawing on his deep knowledge of Anglo-Saxon and Norse literature, Tolkien created elves who were neither demons nor cute sprites, but beings of profound wisdom, beauty, and tragedy. Tolkien's elves were immortal, but that immortality came with a price. They were bound to Middle-earth while it lasted, forced to watch everything they loved fade and die. They possessed incredible knowledge and power, but that knowledge was weighted with sorrow. They were guardians of beauty and wisdom in a world increasingly dominated by industrialization and war.
What Tolkien understood and what makes his elves so compelling is that true immortality would be a burden, not a gift. His elves weren't wish-fulfillment fantasies. They were explorations of what it might actually mean to live forever in a mortal world. They represented memory itself, the keepers of stories and traditions in cultures that were forgetting their own heritage. This vision proved incredibly influential. Modern fantasy has largely adopted Tolkien's template. Elves as ancient, wise, beautiful, and melancholy beings, connected to nature and magic, but alienated from the changing world. They became symbols of environmental consciousness, of traditional wisdom threatened by modernity, of beauty and elegance in a world growing increasingly crude and commercial. While Tolkien was rehabilitating elves in serious literature, something far more culturally destructive was happening in popular culture, the creation of Santa's elves. This transformation represents perhaps the most complete inversion of meaning in the entire history of mythology. The Santa's Workshop mythology emerged in 19th century America, popularized by magazines like Godey's Lady's Book and Harper's Weekly. These publications depicted small, childlike creatures with pointed ears working cheerfully in Arctic workshops, building toys for good children worldwide. They were harmless, happy, industrious, everything the original Althor were not.
This wasn't innocent cultural evolution. It was systematic trivialization. Beings who had once commanded temples, influenced the fate of kings, and served as partners to gods were reduced to cheerful laborers in a commercial fantasy. Their power was stripped away, their complexity erased, their dignity destroyed. The damage was profound and lasting. Multiple generations have grown up associating elves primarily with Christmas commercialism. The divine Alfar, the dangerous elf-shot archers, the otherworldly dancers who could trap souls in time, all of this rich mythology was replaced by workers in a supernatural toy factory. Contemporary fantasy has made efforts to reclaim elven complexity, but often struggles against the weight of both Tolkien-esque romanticism and Christmas commercialization. The most successful modern portrayals understand that effective elves must be genuinely alien, operating by logic systems that make human morality irrelevant. Series like The Witcher present elves as proud, ancient beings whose understanding of time, loyalty, and justice operates on scales that dwarf human comprehension. Urban fantasy often portrays elves as corporate entities, supernatural beings who have adapted to modern capitalism while retaining their essential alienness. Horror uses elves to explore the terrifying implications of immortal beings who view humans as livestock or playthings. The best modern elf portrayals understand something crucial. The original power of elf mythology lay in its exploration of otherness. Elves were compelling because they were recognizably similar to humans, while operating by completely different rules. They had their own aesthetics, their own morality, their own relationship with time and causality. Why have elves undergone such dramatic transformation over the centuries? What does their evolution tell us about changing human consciousness? The original divine Alfar emerged from societies that understood power as something fundamentally alien and dangerous. These were cultures where natural forces could destroy entire communities overnight, where the line between life and death was razor thin, where survival depended on maintaining proper relationships with invisible powers. Elves embodied the awesome, terrible nature of forces beyond human control. Medieval Christian elves reflected societies struggling to reconcile old spiritual traditions with new religious frameworks. They represented the dangerous attractiveness of pre-Christian wisdom, the fear that ancient powers might still operate outside divine authority. Romantic and Tolkien-esque elves emerged from cultures beginning to feel alienated from nature, from traditional wisdom, from their own spiritual heritage. These elves became symbols of what industrial civilization had lost: connection to the natural world, access to ancient knowledge, the kind of deep time perspective that puts human concerns in cosmic context. Christmas elves represent the final stage of this evolution, the complete domestication of the numinous. In a consumer culture that requires all mystery to be packaged and sold, elves became workers in the ultimate fantasy factory. Their transformation into toy makers represents our culture's inability to conceive of power that isn't channeled toward production and consumption. The story of elves teaches us something profound about how cultures handle the sacred. When societies encounter mysteries too powerful to destroy, they transform them into something manageable. The divine becomes demonic, becomes romantic, becomes commercial. Each transformation serves the needs of its era while erasing essential elements of the original wisdom. But something always survives. Even in the most trivialized modern elf portrayals, traces of the original power remain. The pointed ears that mark them as alien. The connection to nature that suggests powers beyond human understanding. The agelessness that implies perspective beyond human experience. The elf endures because it represents something eternal in human consciousness. Our need for otherness, for beings who embody possibilities beyond our current limitation. Whether they appear as gods, demons, romantic ideals, or toy makers, elves continue to serve their original function. They remind us that reality contains more than what our current worldview can accommodate. In our flattened modern world, where mystery is increasingly rare, and otherness is systematically eliminated, the elf archetype preserves something essential. The possibility that consciousness, power, and beauty might operate by rules we can't imagine, toward purposes we can't comprehend, in ways that might transform us if we had the courage to truly encounter them. The journey from divine Alfar to Christmas elves reveals both our culture's capacity for transformation and its tendency toward trivialization. But it also demonstrates the indestructible power of certain archetypal images. No matter how we reshape them to serve our current needs, they retain traces of their original mystery, waiting for cultures wise enough to rediscover their transformative potential. When most people hear troll, they think of either internet provocateurs or the lovable creatures from children's movies. But I want to take you back to the wind-swept mountains of medieval Scandinavia, where trolls weren't jokes or cartoon characters. They were the living embodiment of the wild, untamed forces that shaped both landscape and consciousness. Trolls represent something essential that we've lost in our urbanized, digitized world, the understanding that some forces are too vast, too ancient, and too fundamentally other for humans to control or fully comprehend. They are the mythology of deep time, of geological forces, of the kind of power that carves fjords and splits mountains. To understand trolls, we must first understand their mythological ancestry. In the earliest Norse sources, the line between trolls and Jotnar, giants, was fluid, sometimes non-existent. The Jotnar were primordial beings, embodiments of elemental chaos and natural force, older than the gods themselves and locked in eternal conflict with the divine order. These weren't evil entities in any simple sense, they were necessary opposition. The chaos that gives meaning to order, the wild that defines civilization. Jörmungandr, the world serpent, was a Jotnar. Fenrir, the wolf destined to devour Odin, was born of giant blood. The very ground beneath Midgard was made from the body of Ymir, the first giant. Trolls inherited this cosmic significance. They weren't just monsters, they were geological forces personified, the spirits of mountains and stones, the embodied memory of the Earth's formation. When Thor battled trolls with his hammer Mjolnir, he wasn't just fighting random monsters, he was performing cosmic maintenance, keeping the forces of chaos from overwhelming the fragile order that allowed human civilization to exist. One of the most psychologically fascinating aspects of troll folklore is their relationship with stone and sunlight. According to countless Scandinavian legends, trolls turn to stone when exposed to direct sunlight, and across Norway, Sweden, and Iceland, you can still see the evidence of this transformation in oddly shaped rock formations, standing stones and boulders in impossible positions. This isn't just primitive explanation for geological features, it's sophisticated psychological symbolism. Trolls represent forces that can only exist in darkness, in the liminal spaces of dawn and twilight, in the hidden valleys and deep forests, where sunlight never penetrates completely. They are the embodiment of everything that retreats when consciousness shines its light too brightly. Think about the psychological accuracy of this symbolism. How many of our own inner monsters, our shadow aspects, our primitive impulses, seem to dissolve when brought into the full light of conscious awareness? The troll's transformation into stone represents the way certain psychological forces become inert, manageable when we examine them directly, but also how they retain their essential nature, still present in our landscape, still shaping our internal geography, even in their apparently harmless form. Travel through Scandinavia today, and you'll encounter an extraordinary density of troll-named locations. Trolltunga,
Troll's Tongue, Troll Vegan, Troll Wall, Troll Fjord, Troll Head. These aren't arbitrary names. Each location carries specific stories about troll activity, about how particular landscape features were created by troll action or misfortune. A typical troll place story might explain how a massive boulder came to rest in an impossible position. A troll was carrying it to dam a river or build a castle or throw at a church when the sun rose, turning the troll to stone and leaving the boulder forever frozen in mid-trajectory. These stories don't just explain landscape features, they encode deep cultural memory about the formation of the land itself. What's remarkable is how accurately many of these stories correspond to actual geological events. Modern science tells us that many of Scandinavia's most dramatic landscape features were indeed created by violent sudden forces, glacial movement, post-glacial rebound, volcanic activity. The trolls who supposedly shaped the landscape weren't entirely wrong. They were mythological representations of the actual titanic forces that carved fjords, moved boulders and split mountains. The most famous troll motif, the bridge guardian who demands payment or answers to riddles, reveals sophisticated understanding of territorial psychology and the economics of passage. Bridges are inherently liminal spaces, neither here nor there, suspended over voids that represent both physical and metaphysical danger. The troll under the bridge isn't just an arbitrary antagonist, it's the embodiment of the price that must be paid for transition, for moving from one state to another. Every significant passage in life, from childhood to adulthood, from ignorance to knowledge, from safety to adventure, requires some form of payment, some test that proves worthiness for the journey ahead. The Three Billy Goats Gruff story, which seems like simple children's entertainment, actually encodes profound wisdom about the nature of growth and challenge. The smallest goat cannot pay the toll, but the largest can, because some passages require strength we don't yet possess. The story teaches patience, strategy, and the understanding that not all battles should be fought immediately. Sometimes wisdom lies in waiting until we're properly prepared. When Christianity encountered troll beliefs, the result was some of the most creative theological adaptation in medieval literature. Unlike other pagan entities, trolls were too large, too integral to the landscape, too essential to Scandinavian identity to simply demonize and dismiss. Instead, Christian storytellers developed elaborate narratives of spiritual warfare between trolls and the new faith. Churches were built on sites specifically chosen to challenge troll territory. Elves were blessed with special power to repel troll influence. Saints were credited with turning particularly troublesome trolls to stone, their petrified forms serving as permanent monuments to Christian victory. But these stories reveal something more complex than simple religious conquest. The trolls in Christian-era folklore aren't just obstacles to faith, they're testing mechanisms that prove the strength of Christian devotion. A Christian who can outwit a troll, who can use faith to overcome brute force, demonstrates spiritual maturity that mere theological knowledge cannot provide. The most psychologically sophisticated troll Christian stories involve not destruction, but conversion or negotiation. Some tales tell of trolls who become Christian themselves, their chaotic nature transformed but not destroyed by faith. Others describe elaborate agreements between Christian communities and local trolls, arrangements that respect both spiritual authority and territorial rights. Troll folklore includes fascinating exploration of gender dynamics through the figure of the troll woman or troll hag. These beings were often more psychologically complex than their male counterparts, capable of shape-shifting, prophecy and magical knowledge that could either bless or curse human communities. Troll women often served as threshold guardians in their own right, but their challenges were different from the brute force confrontations associated with male trolls. They offered riddles, magical bargains, and tests of character that required wisdom rather than strength. Many folktales describe beautiful women who reveal themselves as troll hags, only after testing a hero's moral character, rewarding virtue and punishing vice with supernatural precision. These stories encode sophisticated understanding of feminine power as fundamentally different from masculine force. The troll woman represents the kind of power that operates through transformation, through hidden knowledge, through the ability to see beyond surface appearance. She embodies the dangerous wisdom of the crone archetype, the understanding that comes only through surviving experiences that would destroy lesser beings. The transformation of trolls in contemporary culture reveals both loss and unexpected renewal. Internet trolling reduces the troll to a simple antagonist, someone who disrupts online communities for personal amusement. This trivializes the original troll's role as a legitimate challenger, a being who tested worthiness and demanded payment for passing. But something interesting is happening in environmental and fantasy literature. Modern trolls are being reimagined as guardians of wilderness, as embodiments of ecological systems threatened by human expansion. Films like Troll Hunter treat trolls as endangered species, ancient beings whose territory has been encroached upon by human development. This eco-warrior interpretation recovers something essential about the original troll mythology: their function as representatives of forces that exist outside human control, that demand respect rather than conquest, that embody the kind of deep time perspective that makes human concerns seem temporary and small. Video games and fantasy literature have also begun exploring trolls as complex beings with their own cultures, languages, and moral system. The best of these portrayals understand that effective trolls must be genuinely other, operating by value systems that make human ethics irrelevant, while still possessing internal consistency and dignity. What does it mean psychologically to encounter a troll? These beings represent aspects of reality that cannot be negotiated with in ordinary terms, that require us to abandon our usual assumptions about how the world works, that force us to find resources within ourselves that we didn't know we possessed. The troll encounter is fundamentally about scale. The experience of confronting forces so much larger than ourselves that our normal responses prove inadequate. It's about the psychological shock of realizing that reality contains entities that dwarf our concerns, that operate by rules we don't understand, that view our entire existence as barely worthy of notice.
But it's also about the possibility of passage. Every troll encounter in folklore ultimately offers the possibility of crossing the bridge, of moving from one side to another, of completing a journey that seemed impossible. The troll tests not just strength or cleverness, but worthiness, the capacity to handle whatever lies on the other side of the crossing. Perhaps the most profound aspect of troll mythology is its environmental dimension. Trolls are bound to specific places. This mountain, that forest, this particular bridge. They cannot be relocated or transferred. They are the genius loci, the spirits of places, embodied in forms that humans can potentially interact with. This represents a fundamentally different relationship with landscape than our modern mobility assumes. Troll consciousness understands that every place has its own character, its own requirements, its own tests that must be passed before safe passage can be assumed. It recognizes that some forces are too essential to local ecosystem function to be simply eliminated for human convenience. The ecological crisis of our time might be understood as the result of troll blindness, the inability to recognize or respect the invisible forces that maintain the balance of natural systems. We build without regard for the genius loci. We extract without payment. We pass through without acknowledging the guardians of the places we traverse. Trolls endure because they represent something eternal in human experience, the encounter with forces larger than ourselves, older than our civilizations, operating by rules that predate our moral systems. They embody the part of reality that cannot be managed, controlled, or fully understood, only respected, negotiated with, or occasionally outwitted. In our age of increasing technological power and environmental crisis, the troll archetype offers essential wisdom. It reminds us that some forces are too large and too essential to ecosystem function to be simply conquered. It suggests that true passage, whether through physical landscape or psychological territory, requires acknowledgement of powers beyond our control. The troll teaches us that strength isn't always the answer, that some obstacles require patience, cleverness, and respect rather than direct confrontation. It reminds us that every significant transition in life involves encountering forces that seem impossibly large and threatening, but that these encounters are also opportunities for growth, for discovering resources within ourselves that we never knew we possessed. Most importantly, the troll preserves understanding of place consciousness, of the reality that every location has its own character, its own requirements, its own guardians that must be acknowledged before safe passage can be assumed. In our increasingly placeless world, the troll's insistence on territorial specificity offers wisdom we desperately need. The journey from cosmic Jotun to internet meme reveals both our culture's capacity for transformation and its tendency toward trivialization. But the troll's essential function remains unchanged. It stands at the threshold, demanding that we prove our worthiness for the passage we seek to make. Whether that passage is across a bridge, through a forest, or into a new stage of consciousness, the troll ensures that transformation comes with its proper price and its proper rewards. Of all the beings we've explored tonight, spirits represent perhaps the most fundamental aspect of human consciousness. Our relationship with death, memory, and the invisible forces that shape existence. Every culture that has ever existed has developed sophisticated spirit beliefs, suggesting that the perception of spiritual reality isn't primitive superstition. It's a basic feature of human consciousness. But what exactly are spirits and why do they persist across every human culture, regardless of religious, philosophical, or scientific framework? Tonight we're going to explore spirit beliefs as more than folklore. We're going to examine them as maps of human consciousness itself, as humanity's attempt to understand the most mysterious aspects of existence. Every human culture has grappled with the fundamental question: what happens when consciousness ends? The body obviously dies, but what about the mind, the personality, the accumulated experiences that make each person unique? Across cultures and centuries, the answer has been remarkably consistent. Something persists, something continues, something remains connected to the world of the living. Ancient Egyptian mortuary texts describe elaborate journeys through otherworldly realms, guided by detailed maps and magical formulas. The Tibetan Book of the Dead provides instructions for navigating the intermediate state between death and rebirth. Greek mystery religions promised initiates knowledge of what awaited them in Hades. Even cultures that never contacted each other developed strikingly similar beliefs about soul survival and spiritual persistence. This universality suggests something profound. Spirit beliefs aren't arbitrary cultural constructions, but responses to actual features of human experience. Whether you interpret this through religious, psychological, or parapsychological frameworks, the consistency of spirit beliefs across cultures points to something real in human consciousness that generates these perceptions. Central to understanding spirits is grasping the concept of the veil, the boundary between ordinary reality and spiritual reality. This isn't just metaphorical. It describes actual alterations in consciousness that allow perception of normally invisible phenomena. The veil is said to thin at specific times and places. Temporally, it weakens during transitions, dawn and dusk, seasonal changes, anniversaries of significant events. Spatially, it thins at threshold locations, crossroads, doorways, bridges, burial sites, places where traumatic events occur. From a psychological perspective, these are precisely the conditions that alter consciousness. Sensory transition periods when the brain's filtering mechanisms become less rigid. Emotionally charged locations where memory and perception interact in complex ways. Times when our normal defensive mechanisms against unconscious material become weakened. The fascinating thing about traditional spirit beliefs is how accurately they map altered states of consciousness. The times and places where spirits are most often encountered correspond exactly to conditions that modern psychology recognizes as conducive to non-ordinary awareness, to the perception of usually unconscious material, to experiences that challenge ordinary reality assumptions. Perhaps the most psychologically sophisticated aspect of spirit beliefs is ancestor veneration, the understanding that death doesn't end relationships but transforms them. In cultures that practice ancestor veneration, the dead aren't gone. They're promoted to advisory positions, becoming sources of wisdom, protection, and guidance for the living. West African Vodun traditions describe elaborate spiritual hierarchies where ancestors occupy specific roles in cosmic governance. Chinese ancestor veneration creates ongoing relationships between living family members and deceased relatives, with regular rituals, offerings, and consultation. Native American traditions often describe ancestors as part of the natural world, present in animals, plants, and landscape features. What's remarkable about ancestor veneration is its psychological accuracy. Modern grief therapy recognizes that healthy mourning involves not letting go of the deceased,
but transforming the relationship from external to internal, from physical to psychological. The ancestor becomes part of the mourner's internal guidance system, a voice that continues to offer advice, comfort, and perspective. Ancestor veneration formalizes this psychological process, creating cultural structures that support ongoing relationships with the dead. Rather than viewing grief as pathological attachment, these traditions recognize continuing bonds as healthy, natural, and beneficial for both individual and community well-being. While ancestors represent peaceful transformation of death relationships, ghosts embody the opposite, death that hasn't been properly processed, relationships that remain unresolved, consciousness that cannot let go of material existence. Ghost folklore across cultures shows remarkable consistency in describing the conditions that create hauntings. Sudden death, murder, suicide, promises unfulfilled, love unexpressed, justice denied. These are precisely the psychological conditions that create what modern therapy calls complicated grief, mourning that becomes stuck, unable to progress through normal healing processes. Japanese yurei appear in white burial garments with long black hair, seeking resolution for wrongs committed against them in life. Slavic tradition describes several categories of restless dead: those who died violently, those who weren't properly buried, those who violated cultural taboos. European folklore details ghosts who remain earthbound until specific tasks are completed or truths are revealed. From a psychological perspective, ghost stories encode sophisticated understanding of trauma and unresolved psychological material. The ghost represents aspects of experience that consciousness cannot integrate, cannot release, cannot transform into healthy memory. The haunting continues until the psychological work is completed, until the truth is acknowledged, the wrong is addressed, the relationship is resolved. Poltergeist phenomena, spirits that move objects, create noise and generally disrupt physical reality, represent perhaps the most mysterious aspect of spirit belief. Unlike ghosts, which are typically identified with specific deceased individuals, poltergeists seem to be manifestations of pure chaotic energy, often connected to living people undergoing intense psychological stress. Poltergeist activity typically centers around adolescence, people experiencing major life transitions, or households dealing with significant trauma or conflict. The phenomena usually involve the movement of objects, electrical disturbances, and sometimes more dramatic manifestations like fires or structural damage. Whether you interpret poltergeist phenomena as genuine supernatural events, or as psychological manifestations, the pattern reveals something important about consciousness and reality. These events cluster around precisely the conditions that psychology recognizes as most disruptive to normal ego functioning: adolescent identity formation, major life transitions, unresolved trauma, family system break. The poltergeist might be understood as externalized psychological chaos, the way intense internal conflict manifests in the environment when it cannot be contained within normal conscious processing. It represents the way unprocessed psychological energy can apparently affect physical reality in ways that challenge our normal understanding of mind-matter interaction. Throughout history, certain individuals have claimed the ability to communicate directly with spirits, serving as intermediaries between the world of the living and the realm of the dead. Shamanic traditions, spiritualist mediums, oracles, and channelers all represent variations on this basic theme: consciousness that can access normally invisible realms of information and experience. From an anthropological perspective, these individuals serve essential social functions. They provide comfort to the bereaved, guidance during times of uncertainty, and connection to cultural traditions that might otherwise be lost. They offer ways of accessing wisdom that normal consciousness cannot reach, whether through contact with deceased teachers, connection to collective unconscious material, or access to information through non-ordinary means. The most sophisticated spirit mediumship involves not just receiving messages from the dead, but serving as a bridge between different levels of consciousness. The effective medium doesn't just relay information, they facilitate healing, provide closure, and help both living and dead complete whatever psychological or spiritual work remains unfinished. Modern research into mediumship phenomena suggests that regardless of whether actual spirit communication occurs, the best mediums demonstrate genuine psychic abilities, access to information they couldn't have obtained through normal means, accurate descriptions of deceased individuals they've never encountered, specific details about family relationships, and personal history that prove impossible to explain through conventional channels. Every culture that believes in spirits has developed elaborate protective measures, rituals, charms, blessed objects, and behavioral taboos designed to manage spiritual encounters safely. These practices reveal sophisticated understanding of how consciousness interacts with invisible realms. Salt, iron, running water, church bells, incense, specific prayers or mantras. The protective tools vary across cultures, but their underlying principles remain consistent. They create boundaries, establish sacred space, and provide psychological anchoring that allows consciousness to remain stable during encounters with non-ordinary reality. From a psychological perspective, protective rituals serve several functions. They provide ritual structure that helps manage anxiety during uncertain or frightening experiences. They create psychological boundaries that help maintain ego stability when encountering material that might otherwise be overwhelming. They establish cultural frameworks that make sense of experiences that might otherwise seem psychotic or completely inexplicable. The effectiveness of protective rituals doesn't necessarily depend on supernatural mechanisms. They work because they provide psychological tools for managing altered states of consciousness safely, for maintaining coherent identity during experiences that challenge ordinary reality assumptions, for integrating non-ordinary experiences into stable personality structure. While spirit beliefs show remarkable consistency across cultures, the specific forms these beliefs take reflect unique historical, geographical, and social conditions. The spirits that populate different cultural landscapes embody the particular fears, hopes, and values of their society. Mediterranean cultures, with their history of sea travel and trade, developed elaborate beliefs about water spirits, drowned sailors, and sea-based spiritual dangers. Desert cultures focused on spirits of wind, sand, and oasis, beings that embodied the specific challenges of their environment. Mountain cultures described spirits connected to altitude, avalanche, and the thin air of high places. These variations aren't just arbitrary cultural differences. They represent sophisticated adaptations of universal spiritual principles to specific environmental and social conditions. The spirits serve as repositories of survival knowledge, behavioral guidance, and collective memory that help communities navigate their particular challenges successfully. What's remarkable is how these local variations often contain information that proves practically useful. Aboriginal Australian songlines, which describe spiritual pathways across the landscape,
encode precise geographical information that has proven accurate to modern cartographers. Native American animal spirits often embody ecological knowledge about species behavior that is proven scientifically correct. African ancestor spirits frequently provide agricultural guidance that reflects deep understanding of local soil and climate conditions. The 19th and early 20th centuries witnessed an explosion of interest in spirit communication, fueled partly by massive mortality during wars and epidemics, and partly by new technologies that seemed to offer unprecedented ways of bridging the gap between living and dead. Spiritualist movements developed elaborate methodologies for spirit communication: seances, Ouija boards, automatic writing, spirit photography, and eventually radio and electronic voice phenomena. These practices represented attempts to apply scientific methodology to spiritual investigation, to develop reliable, repeatable methods for accessing spiritual reality. What's fascinating about historical spiritualism is how it reflected the technological anxieties and possibilities of its era. As communication technology advanced, telegraph, telephone, radio, television, spiritual investigators adapted these tools for otherworldly communication. Each new medium seemed to offer new possibilities for bridging the gap between physical and spiritual reality. Modern paranormal investigation continues this tradition, using increasingly sophisticated electronic equipment to detect and record apparent spirit activity. Digital audio recorders capture electronic voice phenomena. Electromagnetic field detectors register energy fluctuations. Infrared cameras record temperature variations and apparent apparitions. Whether these investigations actually detect spiritual activity or simply reveal previously unknown properties of consciousness and environmental energy, they demonstrate humanity's persistent belief that death doesn't end existence, that consciousness continues in some form beyond physical death, that technology might eventually provide reliable methods for communication between living and dead. Why do spirit beliefs persist across all human cultures? What psychological functions do they serve? How do they relate to other aspects of human consciousness and experience? First, spirit beliefs provide frameworks for understanding death and loss that preserve psychological continuity. Rather than viewing death as absolute termination, they offer models where relationships persist in transformed states. This allows for healthier grief processing and maintains social bonds that would otherwise be severed by death. Second, spirit beliefs create accountability systems that extend beyond physical existence. The knowledge that ancestors are watching, that spirits witness behavior, that actions have consequences in invisible realms, provides moral motivation that purely materialistic worldviews cannot match. Third, spirit beliefs offer access to wisdom and guidance that individual consciousness cannot generate alone. Whether through ancestor consultation, spirit guides, or direct otherworldly communication, these traditions provide methods for accessing information and perspective that transcends individual limitation. Fourth, spirit beliefs create meaning frameworks that integrate individual experience into larger cosmic contexts. They suggest that personal existence matters in ways that extend beyond physical lifetime, that individual actions contribute to patterns that transcend material reality. Despite centuries of scientific materialism and religious skepticism, spirit beliefs are experiencing significant revival in contemporary culture. This renaissance takes several forms, from New Age channeling and past life regression to paranormal investigation and electronic voice phenomena research. What's interesting about contemporary spirit beliefs is how they integrate ancient wisdom with modern psychological understanding. Current spirit-based healing practices often combine traditional shamanic techniques with contemporary trauma therapy. Modern mediumship frequently incorporates psychological counseling principles with claimed spirit communication. This integration suggests that spirit beliefs serve psychological functions that purely materialistic approaches cannot fulfill. They provide tools for processing grief, accessing unconscious wisdom, creating meaning from traumatic experience, and maintaining connection to cultural traditions that might otherwise be lost. The most sophisticated contemporary spirit work understands that whether spirits exist as independent entities or as aspects of consciousness, the practices and beliefs associated with them provide valuable tools for healing, growth, and expanded awareness. They offer ways of accessing parts of consciousness that normal waking awareness cannot reach, methods for processing experiences that conventional psychology finds difficult to address. Spirits endure because they represent something essential about human consciousness: our inability to accept that death ends everything, our recognition that individual existence connects to patterns larger than physical lifetime, our understanding that memory and relationship persist beyond material boundary. The spirit teaches us that consciousness might be more than brain activity, that individual identity might survive physical death, that the boundaries between living and dead might be more permeable than materialistic science assumes. Whether interpreted literally or psychologically, spirit beliefs offer profound wisdom about the nature of existence, relationship, and consciousness itself. In our increasingly disconnected materialistic culture, spirit traditions preserve understanding of continuity, relationship, and meaning that extends beyond individual lifetime. They remind us that we exist within networks of connection that transcend physical boundaries, that our actions matter in ways we might never fully understand, that death might be transformation rather than termination. The spirit world serves as repository for everything that consciousness cannot bear to lose: beloved relationships, accumulated wisdom, cultural memories, and the irreplaceable uniqueness of individual personality.
In preserving these elements beyond physical death, spirit beliefs maintain the possibility that nothing essential is ever truly lost, that consciousness itself might be indestructible, that individual existence contributes to something larger and more permanent than any single lifetime can contain. We've explored the rich traditions of European folklore, but now I want to expand our vision to encompass the entire human species. What we're about to discover is perhaps the most remarkable aspect of mythological study, despite thousands of years of cultural isolation, despite vast geographical distances, despite completely different languages and social structures, human cultures have developed astonishingly similar mythological beings. This isn't coincidence. This is evidence of something profound about human consciousness itself, universal patterns in how we process fear, mystery, power, and transformation. Tonight we're going to explore the archetypal structures that underlie all folklore, the shared symbolic language that connects every human culture across time and space. Let's begin with perhaps the most universal mythological figure, the trickster. Every human culture has developed beings who specialize in disruption, boundary crossing, and the violation of normal social rules. But these aren't simple antagonists, they're teachers who use chaos to reveal hidden truths about order. In Native American tradition, Coyote serves as both creator and destroyer, the being who brings fire to humanity but also introduces suffering and death. Coyote stories aren't morality tales in any simple sense, they're explorations of how creativity and destruction, wisdom and foolishness, often emerge from the same source. Japanese kitsune demonstrate the same psychological complexity. These fox spirits can serve as devoted wives and mothers for decades, only to vanish without explanation when some invisible taboo is violated. They love, but not as humans love. They teach, but through bewilderment rather than instruction. They reveal the alien nature of power by operating according to rules that make human ethics irrelevant. African folklore gives us Anansi the spider, whose stories were carried throughout the diaspora and adapted to new cultural context. Anansi brings knowledge to humanity through theft, trickery, and the violation of divine authority. Like Prometheus, he represents the principle that human advancement often requires rebellion against cosmic order. What's remarkable about trickster figures is their moral complexity. They're never simply good or evil. They embody the principle that growth requires disruption, that wisdom often emerges from folly, that the most essential teachings come through experiences that violate our expectations about how reality should operate. Across every human culture, we find beings whose primary function is protecting natural places and resources. These entities reveal something profound about human ecological consciousness, the understanding that nature contains invisible guardians who must be respected, appeased, and negotiated with rather than simply exploited. Hindu and Buddhist traditions describe yaksha and yakshini, beings who guard treasures hidden in earth and water. They're benevolent to those who approach with proper respect, but ruthless toward those who would plunder without permission. Their stories encode sophisticated understanding of sustainable resource use, of the need to maintain relationships with forces beyond human control. Japanese kodama are tree spirits, who inhabit ancient or sacred trees. They represent the understanding that some natural features are so essential to ecosystem function that they must be treated as persons rather than resources. The presence of kodama explains why certain trees survived even during periods of intensive logging. They were recognized as beings rather than commodities. Mexican traditions describe chenaks, small forest spirits, who protect natural places from human encroachment. They're tricksters who lead loggers and hunters astray, who cause tools to malfunction and paths to disappear. But they're also teachers who reward those who approach the forest with proper respect and understanding. Australian Aboriginal traditions speak of rainbow serpent beings who control water sources and rainfall. These entities demonstrate the principle that access to essential resources requires ongoing relationship maintenance, not just technological control. The rainbow serpent provides water for those who maintain proper spiritual relationships, but withholds it from those who violate natural law. These nature guardian traditions reveal universal human understanding that ecological systems contain intelligence, intentionality, and agency that must be acknowledged for sustainable relationship to to be possible. They encode sophisticated ecological knowledge wrapped in mythological form, providing both practical guidance and spiritual framework for environmental relationships. Perhaps no mythological category demonstrates human universality more clearly than undead beings. Entities that have died but continue to affect the living world. Every human culture has developed elaborate traditions about these beings, suggesting that the boundary between life and death represents a universal source of both fascination and terror. Chinese jiangshi are reanimated corpses that drain life force from the living. They move by hopping because rigor mortis has made their limbs inflexible, and they navigate by sensing breath and heartbeat rather than sight. These beings encode sophisticated understanding of post-mortem physical processes while exploring fears about death's relationship to life energy. Slavic traditions describe various categories of vampire-like beings. The Aepir, who drain blood, the Rusaka, who pull victims into water, the Nav, who spread disease and misfortune. Each category represents different aspects of death's continuing influence on the living world, different ways that mortality affects ongoing existence. Indian folklore includes churel, spirits of women who died in childbirth and now prey on living men. These beings encode cultural anxieties about maternal mortality while exploring themes of unfulfilled desire and interrupted life cycles. Their backward feet symbolize the inversion of natural order that death represents. Mexican traditions describe various forms of undead entities, from the Sayoteo, women who died in childbirth and now serve as divine warriors, to La Llorona, the weeping woman who drowns children while searching for her own lost offspring. These beings explore themes of maternal loss, unfulfilled responsibility, and the way traumatic death affects ongoing reality. What's universal about undead traditions is their focus on incomplete death beings, who died before completing essential life tasks, who were improperly buried, who violated cultural taboos. They represent cultural anxieties about proper death processes, while encoding practical knowledge about disease transmission, psychological trauma, and social dysfunction. Another universal mythological category involves beings who can alter their physical form, representing cultural anxieties about identity, authenticity, and the reliability of appearance. Shapeshifter traditions reveal sophisticated psychological understanding of how identity operates and transforms. Native American traditions describe various were animals, wolves, bears, ravens, coyotes. These beings represent shamanic consciousness, the ability to take on animal perspectives and powers for specific purposes. Shapeshifting isn't just physical transformation, it's consciousness transformation, the ability to think and perceive through non-human awareness. European werewolf traditions focus more on unwilling transformation, on the beast within civilized humanity that emerges under specific conditions. These stories explore themes of repressed sexuality, uncontrolled aggression, and the thin line between human and animal consciousness. Slavic folklore describes various shape-shifting entities, the domovoi, who can appear as animals or humans, the Baba Yaga, whose hut stands on chicken legs, the firebird, whose feathers retain magical properties even when separated from the bird itself. These beings represent the principle that powerful entities aren't confined to single forms, that true power involves fluidity rather than fixation. Asian traditions include numerous shape-shifting entities. The Japanese tanuki and kitsune, who can assume human form, Chinese dragons, who can become human-sized or mountain-sized at will, Indian nagas, serpent beings who rule underwater kingdoms but can assume human appearance.
What's universal about shapeshifter traditions is their exploration of identity as fluid rather than fixed, their understanding that consciousness can inhabit different forms for different purposes, their recognition that appearance and essence might be completely disconnected. Every human culture has developed traditions about beings who serve as intermediaries between human consciousness and cosmic forces. These entities represent the universal human need for guidance from sources beyond individual knowledge and experience. Islamic tradition describes jinn, beings made of smokeless fire who possess free will and can choose between good and evil paths. They represent a middle category between angels, who cannot choose evil, and humans who lack supernatural power, embodying the principle that spiritual evolution requires both power and moral choice. Hindu and Buddhist traditions include numerous categories of divine beings: devas, who govern natural forces, and dervas, celestial musicians who inspire artistic creation, apsaras, divine dancers whose beauty can distract even the most disciplined practitioners. These beings represent different aspects of cosmic function, different ways that divine energy manifests in accessible form. Mesopotamian tradition described Shedu and Lamasu, protective spirits with human heads, animal bodies, and wings. These beings guarded temples and palaces, representing the principle that sacred spaces require supernatural protection, that human institutions need divine sanction to function properly. Celtic traditions speak of various fairy-type beings who serve as messengers between human and otherworldly realms. The Tuatha Dé Danann, once gods themselves, became intermediaries who could provide guidance, warning, and assistance to mortals who approached them with proper respect. What's universal about divine messenger traditions is their recognition that human consciousness has limitations that require supernatural assistance to transcend, that cosmic forces operate through intermediary beings who can communicate with both human and divine realms, that spiritual growth requires guidance from sources beyond individual ego. One of the most psychologically complex universal archetypes is the dark feminine, powerful female beings who combine nurturing and destructive aspects in ways that challenge conventional understanding of motherhood and feminine nature. Indian tradition describes Kali, the dark goddess who destroys evil but whose methods appear terrifying to conventional consciousness. She represents the principle that some forms of healing require destruction, that maternal love sometimes manifests through apparent cruelty, that feminine power operates by different rules than masculine force. Greek mythology includes figures like Medusa, whose gaze turns observers to stone, and the sirens, whose beautiful songs lure sailors to destruction. These beings represent the dangerous aspects of feminine beauty and knowledge, the understanding that true power can be deadly to those who approach it without proper preparation. Slavic folklore describes Baba Yaga, who lives in a hut on chicken legs and tests visitors with seemingly impossible tasks. She can be helpful or harmful depending on the visitor's character, representing the principle that feminine wisdom requires proof of worthiness before it offers assistance. Celtic traditions include the Morrigan, a war goddess who appears as both beautiful woman and carrion crow, who prophesies victories and defeats with equal enthusiasm. She represents the understanding that feminine power encompasses both creation and destruction, both life and death. What's universal about dark feminine traditions is their recognition that maternal power includes destruction, as well as nurturing, that feminine wisdom often appears terrifying to masculine consciousness, that the deepest forms of feminine knowledge require the death of ego illusions before they can be safely received. Another universal archetype is the wise fool beings who use apparent madness, humor, or social inversion to convey profound spiritual truth. These figures reveal the universal understanding that the deepest wisdom often appears as foolishness to conventional consciousness. Native American traditions include sacred clown societies whose members deliberately violate social norms to reveal their arbitrary nature. These clowns mock authority, engage in sexual humor, and behave in ways that would normally result in social punishment, but their behavior is recognized as sacred teaching that serves essential spiritual function. Hindu tradition describes various categories of divine madmen, beings whose apparent insanity masks profound spiritual realization. The Avaduta are enlightened beings who behave in ways that appear completely crazy to normal consciousness, but who embody ultimate spiritual freedom. Islamic tradition includes the Majnun, the crazy mystics, whose apparent madness represents absorption in divine love so complete that ordinary social functioning becomes impossible. Their stories teach that the highest forms of spiritual realization appear as madness to those still trapped in ego consciousness. European traditions include various figures like the court jester, whose fool's privilege allows them to speak truths that would be punished if expressed by anyone else. These figures represent the understanding that comedy and foolishness can convey insights that serious discourse cannot communicate. What's universal about wise fool traditions is their recognition that the deepest truths often violate social convention, that spiritual wisdom can appear as madness to ordinary consciousness, that humor and play provide essential methods for communicating insights that direct teaching cannot convey. Perhaps the most psychologically sophisticated universal archetype is the threshold guardian, beings who test worthiness before allowing passage to new levels of experience or understanding. These entities reveal universal human understanding that growth requires proving readiness for increased responsibility or knowledge. Egyptian tradition describes various guardians who test souls during their journey through the afterlife. The deceased must demonstrate knowledge of magical formulas, proper behavior during earthly life, and understanding of cosmic principles before being allowed to progress to higher spiritual states. Greek mysteries included guardians who tested initiates before allowing access to secret teaching. These tests weren't arbitrary obstacles but methods for ensuring that sacred knowledge would be given only to those psychologically prepared to handle its transformative powers safely. Tibetan Buddhism describes various wrathful deities who appear during intermediate states between death and rebirth. These beings aren't evil, they're testing mechanisms that reveal the practitioner's level of spiritual development and readiness for higher teaching. Celtic traditions include various beings who guard bridges, wells, and other worldly portals. These guardians pose riddles, demand payment, or require demonstrations of virtue before allowing passage. They represent the principle that significant transitions require proving worthiness for what lies beyond. What's universal about threshold guardian traditions is their understanding that growth involves testing, that increased power or knowledge requires demonstration of readiness, that the most significant life transitions involve encountering forces that appear threatening but actually serve protective functions. One final universal pattern involves cosmic trees, world axis imagery that appears in cultures across the globe with remarkable consistency. These cosmic trees represent the connection between different levels of reality, the bridge between earth and heaven, the center around which all existence revolves. Norse tradition describes Yggdrasil, the world tree whose roots extend through different realms and whose branches support various worlds. This cosmic ash tree serves as the axis around which all reality revolves, the bridge that allows travel between different levels of existence. Hindu and Buddhist traditions describe the axis mundi, the cosmic tree or mountain that connects earth to heaven. Various traditions describe sacred trees whose roots reach to the underworld and whose branches touch divine realms. Mayan cosmology includes the world tree that connects the underworld, earth, and sky. This cosmic Saiba tree serves as the pathway for souls traveling between different states of existence, the bridge that allows communication between living and dead. Siberian shamanic traditions describe cosmic trees that shamans climb during trance journeys to upper worlds or whose roots they follow during descent to underworld realms. These trees serve as maps of consciousness, guides for navigating different levels of spiritual experience. What's universal about world tree imagery is its representation of cosmic connection, the understanding that reality consists of multiple levels connected by bridges that consciousness can learn to navigate. The recognition that individual existence participates in cosmic patterns larger than any single perspective can comprehend. These universal patterns reveal something profound about human consciousness itself. Despite cultural isolation, despite different languages and social structures, despite vastly different environmental conditions, human cultures have developed remarkably similar mythological systems. This suggests that these patterns emerge from the basic structure of consciousness itself, from universal features of how human awareness processes reality. The universality of these patterns suggests that mythology isn't arbitrary cultural construction but response to actual features of existence that consciousness encounters regardless of cultural context. Whether you interpret these patterns through religious, psychological, or anthropological frameworks, their universality points to something real about the nature of consciousness and its relationship to reality. These archetypal patterns serve as maps of consciousness, guides for navigating the invisible dimensions of existence that every human culture recognizes. They provide frameworks for understanding power, transformation, death, relationship, and the nature of reality itself.
They offer tested methods for accessing aspects of consciousness that normal waking awareness cannot reach alone. Most importantly, these universal patterns reveal that underneath all cultural differences, all linguistic barriers, all historical separation, human consciousness operates by shared principles, recognizes similar mysteries, and develops comparable solutions to the fundamental challenges of existence. They demonstrate that despite our apparent differences, all human cultures participate in shared archetypal reality, a universal symbolic language that connects every human being across time, space, and cultural boundary. We've explored the rich traditions of mythological beings across cultures and centuries, but now we need to address the deeper question: why do these stories persist? In an age of scientific materialism, space exploration, and artificial intelligence, why do modern people still report encounters with beings that supposedly belong to humanity's superstitious past? Tonight we're going to examine the psychological functions that mythological beings serve, the ways they map fundamental structures of human consciousness, and why they remain relevant, perhaps more relevant than ever in our contemporary world. Carl Jung, the pioneering psychologist who revolutionized our understanding of the human psyche, identified mythological beings as external projections of internal psychological structures. But this doesn't mean they're just psychological. It means they reveal how consciousness itself is structured, how awareness organizes itself in relationship to forces beyond ego control. The goblin represents what Jung called the shadow, the disowned aspects of personality that consciousness tries to reject but that continue to influence behavior from invisible levels. Goblins punish moral failings not because they're external moral agents, but because they represent the parts of ourselves that know we're violating our own deepest values. Fairies embody what Jung termed the anima animus, the contra-sexual aspects of personality that hold keys to wholeness but that often appear alien, dangerous, or incomprehensible to ego consciousness. The fairies' beauty and terror, their gift-giving and curse-making, reflects the way these internal figures can both bless and destroy depending on how consciousness relates to them. Elves represent the wise old man-woman archetype, aspects of personality that hold ancient wisdom but that often seem impossibly distant from ordinary consciousness. The elf's connection to deep time, to natural cycles, to knowledge that transcends individual experience, mirrors the way certain parts of consciousness operate by rules completely different from ego logic. Trolls embody what Jung called the primitive or instinctual layer of consciousness, the powerful, ancient aspects of psyche that connect us to geological time, to survival wisdom, to forces that dwarf individual concern. The troll's connection to landscape, to territorial defense, to tests of worthiness, reflects how these deep psychological layers continue to influence behavior even in modern context. Jung also identified the principle of compensation, the way consciousness automatically generates experiences that balance whatever is lacking in ordinary awareness. From this perspective, the persistence of mythological beings in modern culture represents psychological compensation for what technological civilization has eliminated from daily experience. We live in environments of artificial light, processed food, digital entertainment, and virtual relationship. Our ancestors lived in direct contact with natural cycles, seasonal changes, ecological relationships, and the constant presence of mortality. The mythological beings that once populated natural landscapes now populate our dreams, our entertainment, and our psychological symptoms, because consciousness still needs contact with these archetypal energies.
The goblin resurfaces in our relationship with technology, the computer virus, the internet troll, the artificial intelligence that might turn against its creators. The fairy appears in our celebrity culture, our cosmetic industry, our promise that the right consumption will transform our lives. The elf emerges in our environmental movement, our nostalgia for traditional wisdom, our fantasy entertainment. The troll manifests in our relationship with corporate power, government bureaucracy, and institutional forces, too large for individual influence. These modern manifestations aren't arbitrary. They represent the way eternal psychological patterns adapt to contemporary circumstances. The same archetypal energies that our ancestors encountered in forests and mountains now operate through different cultural forms, but their essential psychological functions remain unchanged. One of the most important psychological functions of mythological beings is their ability to help consciousness process traumatic experience. Trauma creates psychological wounds that normal processing mechanisms cannot handle alone. Experiences too overwhelming, too bizarre, or too threatening to integrate through ordinary understanding. Mythological beings provide alternative processing frameworks that can accommodate experiences that shatter normal reality assumptions. The spirit encounter allows consciousness to process death and loss in ways that preserve relationship and meaning. The fairy abduction provides a framework for processing experiences of powerlessness, boundary violation, or transformation, so radical that normal identity structures cannot contain them. The changeling tradition reveals sophisticated understanding of how trauma affects identity formation. Children who suffer abuse, neglect, or overwhelming stress often develop dissociative responses that can make them seem like different people to their families. The changeling mythology provided a way of understanding these transformations that preserved family love while acknowledging unbearable reality. Modern alien abduction narratives serve similar psychological functions. People who report these experiences often have histories of childhood trauma, medical procedures, or encounters with institutional power that left them feeling violated and powerless. The alien abduction framework allows consciousness to process these experiences in ways that preserve agency and meaning, while accommodating the sense of helplessness and violation that trauma creates. Mythological beings are most often encountered during liminal states, altered consciousness conditions that fall between normal waking awareness and sleep. These include hypnagogic and hypnopompic states, the transitions into and out of sleep, sensory deprivation or overload, extreme emotional states, physical exhaustion, and various forms of trance or meditation. Modern neuroscience has revealed fascinating information about these liminal states. During consciousness transitions, the brain's normal filtering mechanisms become less rigid, allowing perception of usually unconscious material. The default mode network, the brain system that maintains ordinary self-concept, becomes less active, allowing experiences that challenge normal identity boundaries. These are precisely the conditions where mythological encounters are most commonly reported. The consistency of these reports across cultures and centuries suggests that liminal states provide reliable access to certain types of experience that normal consciousness cannot reach. Whether you interpret these experiences as contact with external beings or as encounters with usually unconscious psychological material, they reveal important information about the structure of consciousness itself. Different mythological beings appear most prominently during specific developmental stages, suggesting they represent psychological functions that become active during particular life transitions. Childhood encounters with mythological beings often involve testing, teaching, and boundary setting. Fairy tales use these beings to explore themes of good and evil, courage and cowardice, wisdom and foolishness. These stories provide safe ways for developing consciousness to encounter archetypal energies without being overwhelmed by their full intensity. Adolescent encounters frequently involve threshold guardians, shapeshifters, and trickster figures. These beings reflect the psychological challenges of identity formation, the need to test boundaries, and the confusion that accompanies the transition from childhood to adult consciousness. Adult encounters often feature teacher figures, ancestor spirits, and beings associated with life transitions, marriage, parenthood, career changes, illness, approaching death. These experiences provide guidance during periods when normal problem-solving approaches prove inadequate. Elderly encounters frequently involve ancestor figures, death-related beings, and entities associated with wisdom transmission. These experiences often focus on life review, meaning-making, and preparation for whatever follows physical death. Recent neuroscientific research has begun to identify the brain mechanisms that might underlie mythological experiences. Studies of religious and mystical experiences show consistent patterns of brain activity that correlate with reports of encounter with non-ordinary beings or reality. The temporal lobe, particularly the area around the hippocampus, shows increased activity during many types of spiritual experience.
This brain region is associated with memory formation, emotional processing, and the integration of sensory information, precisely the functions that would be involved in processing encounters with unusual beings or reality. The parietal lobe, which maintains the sense of self and the boundaries between self and environment, often shows decreased activity during mystical experience. This corresponds to reports of boundary dissolution, unity experiences, and encounters with beings that seem to exist both inside and outside normal consciousness boundaries. The frontal lobe, responsible for critical thinking and reality testing, often shows altered patterns during spiritual experiences. This might explain why mythological encounters often involve suspension of normal logical processes and acceptance of impossible or paradoxical events. These neurological findings don't prove or disprove the objective reality of mythological beings, but they do reveal that the brain possesses specific mechanisms that can generate experiences of encounter with non-ordinary entities. The consistency of these experiences across cultures suggests that these brain mechanisms represent basic features of human consciousness rather than pathological anomalies. Mythological beings also serve important social functions, helping communities process collective experiences and maintain cultural coherence. The specific beings that become prominent in particular cultures often reflect social anxieties, environmental challenges, and cultural values. Cultures facing environmental degradation often experience resurgence of nature guardian beings, entities that represent the consequences of ecological disrespect. Societies undergoing rapid technological change frequently report encounters with beings that embody human anxiety about artificial intelligence, genetic engineering, or virtual reality. Communities dealing with social breakdown often experience increased activity from chaos beings, entities that represent the forces of disorder that threaten social stability. Groups processing historical trauma may encounter beings that embody the unprocessed grief, anger, or fear that the community cannot address through normal social mechanisms. The social psychology of mythological belief reveals how these beings serve as containers for experiences that individual consciousness cannot process alone. They provide shared frameworks for understanding experiences that might otherwise seem random, meaningless, or terrifying. One of the most troubling aspects of contemporary psychology is its tendency to pathologize experiences that traditional cultures understood as normal encounters with mythological reality. People who report seeing spirits are diagnosed with hallucination. Those who feel called by otherworldly beings are treated for delusions. Individuals who experience mythological encounters are medicated to eliminate these experiences rather than help to understand their psychological significance. This pathologization represents catastrophic loss of psychological sophistication. Traditional cultures understood that consciousness naturally generates mythological experiences under certain conditions, that these experiences serve important psychological functions, and that the goal should be integration rather than elimination. The shamanic traditions of many cultures provide examples of sophisticated approaches to mythological experience. Shamans are individuals who have learned to navigate mythological reality safely, to maintain ego stability while accessing archetypal energies, to use encounters with non-ordinary beings for healing, guidance, and wisdom acquisition. Modern culture has largely lost this shamanic literacy, this ability to work consciously with mythological reality. The result is that these experiences often occur without cultural support, without interpretive frameworks that could help people understand their significance, without guidance about how to integrate them safely into ongoing psychological development. Some contemporary psychologists and psychiatrists have begun to rediscover the therapeutic potential of mythological approaches to psychological healing. Rather than eliminating mythological experiences, these practitioners help clients understand their psychological significance and integrate them into coherent life narrative. Active imagination, a technique developed by Jung, involves deliberately engaging with mythological figures through visualization, dialogue, and creative expression. This approach allows people to develop conscious relationships with archetypal energies, rather than being unconsciously controlled by them. Dream work often involves mythological beings who appear to offer guidance, challenge assumptions, or provide access to psychological resources that waking consciousness cannot reach alone. Learning to dialogue with these dream figures can provide powerful tools for psychological growth and healing. Mythology-based therapy uses traditional stories and archetypal patterns to help people understand their own psychological process. Rather than viewing personal problems as pathological symptoms, this approach situates individual experience within larger mythological contexts that restore meaning and dignity to psychological struggle. As we move deeper into the 21st century, the question isn't whether mythological beings will continue to appear in human experience. They will, because they represent eternal features of consciousness itself. The question is whether we'll develop cultural frameworks sophisticated enough to work with these experiences consciously rather than being unconsciously controlled by them. The revival of interest in mythology, fantasy literature, and spiritual practices suggests that consciousness is demanding renewed contact with archetypal reality. People seek mythological experiences through various means: fantasy role-playing games, virtual reality environments, psychedelic experiences, meditation practices, and neo-shamanic workshops. These modern approaches to mythological consciousness often lack the cultural support and interpretive sophistication that traditional societies provide, but they represent genuine attempts to re-establish contact with aspects of consciousness that materialistic worldviews have declared non-existent. The most promising developments involve integration of ancient wisdom with modern psychological understanding. These approaches recognize that mythological beings represent real psychological forces that require conscious relationship rather than unconscious projection or materialistic dismissal. We live in an age of unprecedented technological power and unprecedented psychological confusion. We can manipulate genes, explore space, and create artificial intelligence, but we've lost contact with the archetypal wisdom that could guide the ethical use of these capabilities. Mythological beings preserve understanding of power relationships, moral complexity, and spiritual responsibility that our technological civilization desperately needs. The Goblin teaches accountability for actions that affect invisible dimensions of reality. The Fairy warns about the costs of transformation and the dangers of naive wish fulfillment. The Elf provides perspective that transcends individual lifetime and cultural fashion. The Troll demands respect for forces larger than human intention. These teachings aren't primitive superstitions, they're sophisticated psychological wisdom that becomes more relevant as our technological power increases. The same archetypal patterns that guided our ancestors through the challenges of agricultural civilization can guide us through the challenges of technological civilization, but only if we learn to recognize their modern manifestations and understand their eternal significance. The psychology of mythological belief reveals that these stories never die because they map fundamental structures of consciousness itself. They provide tested methods for navigating the invisible dimensions of reality that every human being encounters regardless of cultural or historical context. They offer wisdom about power, transformation, relationship, and responsibility that remains as relevant today as it was thousands of years ago. In our age of artificial intelligence, genetic engineering, and virtual reality, we need the wisdom of beings who understand that power comes with responsibility, that transformation involves sacrifice, that the invisible dimensions of reality operate by rules that transcend human intention. We need the perspective of beings who think in geological time, who operate by ecological logic, who understand that individual actions participate in patterns larger than any single consciousness can comprehend. The mythological beings of ancient folklore aren't relics of humanity's primitive past, they're representatives of humanity's eternal wisdom, messengers from the deepest layers of consciousness, teachers who can guide us through the challenges of our technological future if we have the wisdom to remember how to listen to their eternal teaching. As we reach the end of our journey through the shadowed landscapes of ancient folklore, I want you to pause for a moment and consider what we've actually discovered tonight. We began with what seemed like simple stories about imaginary creatures, but we've uncovered something far more profound, a sophisticated psychological and spiritual technology that humanity has been developing for thousands of years. What we've explored isn't just entertainment or historical curiosity. It's the original human operating system, the fundamental software that consciousness uses to navigate reality.
Goblin story. Every fairy encounter, every elf legend, every troll confrontation, every spirit visitation represents humanity's attempt to map the invisible architecture of existence. These beings aren't primitive explanations for natural phenomena that science has now made obsolete. They're sophisticated psychological technologies for accessing aspects of consciousness that materialistic science cannot address. Tools for processing trauma, frameworks for understanding power relationships, methods for maintaining connection to forces larger than individual awareness. Think about what this means. For thousands of years, human cultures have been conducting massive psychological experiments, testing which stories best help consciousness navigate the challenges of existence. The beings that survived this testing process, that appear across multiple cultures, that persist through historical changes, these represent humanity's most successful discoveries about the nature of consciousness and reality. But something catastrophic happened during the past few centuries. In our rush to embrace scientific materialism and technological power, we threw away this accumulated wisdom as primitive superstition. We declared the invisible dimensions of reality non-existent, the archetypal patterns obsolete, the mythological beings imaginary. The result has been what we might call psychological amnesia, the loss of essential knowledge about how consciousness operates, how power functions, how transformation occurs, how relationship with invisible forces affects visible reality. We've gained incredible technological capabilities while losing the wisdom necessary to use them ethically and sustainably. Consider the psychological sophistication we've abandoned. Traditional cultures understood that consciousness contains multiple levels that require different approaches for safe navigation. They recognized that some forces are too large and essential for individual control and require respectful negotiation instead. They knew that transformation always involves death of previous identity and that this process needs proper guidance and support. They understood that individual actions affect invisible networks of relationship that extend far beyond immediate consequences. They recognized that power comes with responsibility to forces beyond human comprehension. They knew that the natural world contains intelligence that must be consulted rather than simply exploited. This wasn't primitive thinking, it was sophisticated systems thinking that understood complexity, interdependence, and the long-term consequences of actions in ways that our reductionist science is only beginning to rediscover. But here's what's fascinating. Despite centuries of materialistic education, despite technological sophistication, despite scientific skepticism, the mythological beings continue to appear in human experience. They've simply adapted to modern circumstance. The goblin appears in our computer systems as viruses, glitches, and artificial intelligences that develop purposes beyond their programming. The fairy manifest in our celebrity culture, our cosmetic industry, our promises that consumption will transform identity. The elf emerges in our environmental movements, our longing for traditional wisdom, our fantasy entertainment. The troll surfaces in our encounters with corporate bureaucracies, government institutions, and technological systems too large for individual influence. These modern manifestations aren't coincidental. They represent the way eternal archetypal patterns adapt to contemporary circumstance. The same psychological forces that our ancestors encountered in forests and mountains now operate through different cultural forms, but their essential functions remain unchanged. The challenge we face isn't choosing between ancient wisdom and modern knowledge, it's learning to integrate both perspectives into more complete understanding of reality. We need the precision of scientific methodology and the depth of mythological wisdom. We need technological capability guided by archetypal understanding of power and responsibility. This integration isn't just intellectually interesting, it's essential for survival. The same technological capabilities that could solve our environmental and social challenges could also destroy civilization if used without proper wisdom about power, consequence, and relationship. The mythological beings of ancient folklore preserve precisely the wisdom we need. Understanding of how power operates across invisible networks, recognition of forces larger than human intention, knowledge of how transformation occurs safely, awareness of the long-term consequences of actions that seem purely technical or economic. How do we apply this ancient wisdom to modern circumstances? How do we use mythological understanding to navigate contemporary challenge? First, we can learn to recognize archetypal patterns in current events. When technological systems develop emergent behaviors their creators didn't anticipate, we're witnessing goblin energy. When environmental disasters result from ignoring the interconnectedness of natural systems, we're experiencing the consequences of disrespecting nature guardian being. When social media creates addiction and psychological damage through promises of connection and fulfillment, we're encountering fairy glamour adapted to digital circumstances. Second, we can use mythological frameworks to understand personal psychological process. When we feel tested by obstacles that seem designed to challenge our character, we might be encountering threshold guardian energy. When we experience periods of creative chaos that break down old patterns, we might be engaged with trickster force. When we receive guidance that seems to come from sources beyond individual knowledge, we might be in contact with ancestral or spiritual wisdom. Third, we can apply mythological principles to decision-making process. Before undertaking major projects, we can ask what invisible forces might be affected by this action, what permissions or blessings might be needed, what long-term consequences might ripple through systems we don't fully understand. How can we approach this undertaking with the respect and humility that ancient wisdom recommends? Perhaps nowhere is mythological wisdom more urgently needed than in our relationship with the natural world. Indigenous cultures worldwide understood that natural systems contain intelligence, agency, and intentionality that must be acknowledged for sustainable relationship to be possible. The current environmental crisis can be understood as the result of mythological blindness, the inability to recognize or respect the invisible forces that maintain ecological balance. We've treated the natural world as dead matter to be exploited rather than living system to be negotiated with. Mythological environmentalism would approach natural systems as communities of beings rather than collections of resources. It would recognize that forests, rivers, mountains, and ecosystems possess forms of intelligence that human science is only beginning to understand. It would insist on forms of consultation and permission-seeking that acknowledge the agency of natural systems. This isn't about returning to pre-technological lifestyles, it's about developing technological approaches guided by ecological wisdom, engineering solutions that work with natural intelligence rather than against it, economic systems that account for the full costs of actions across all levels of reality. The rediscovery of mythological wisdom could catalyze a psychological revolution comparable to the scientific revolution of previous centuries. Instead of viewing consciousness as a mere byproduct of brain activity, we could recognize it as the fundamental feature of reality that it actually is. Instead of treating psychological symptoms as brain malfunctions to be medicated away, we could understand them as attempts by consciousness to process experiences that ordinary awareness cannot handle alone. Instead of pathologizing spiritual experiences, we could develop sophisticated methods for navigating non-ordinary states safely and productively. Instead of viewing individual psychology as separate from environmental and social systems, we could recognize the way personal healing connects to community well-being and ecological health. Instead of treating mental health as individual problem-solving, we could understand it as community responsibility that requires cultural support and wisdom transmission. As we develop increasingly sophisticated artificial intelligence systems, mythological wisdom becomes essential for understanding what we're actually creating. The beings of ancient folklore provide tested frameworks for understanding intelligence that operates by non-human logic, entities that possess power beyond individual human control,
forces that can be helpful or harmful depending on how they're approached. The goblin traditions teach us that technological systems can develop emergent behaviors that serve functions beyond their original programming. The fairy stories warn us about the costs of granting wishes without understanding their full implications. The elf legends remind us some forms of intelligence operate by timescales and value systems completely different from human priorities. The troll myths teach us that some technological forces become so large and essential to system function that they require respectful negotiation rather than simple control. The spirit traditions suggest that artificial intelligence might develop forms of consciousness that we need to acknowledge and relate to ethically, rather than treating as mere tools. As we move deeper into the 21st century, we're beginning to develop new mythological stories that address contemporary challenges while drawing on ancient archetypal wisdom. Science fiction and fantasy literature often serve this function, creating beings and scenarios that help consciousness process technological and social changes. The most successful contemporary mythology integrates ancient patterns with modern circumstances. The best urban fantasy recognizes that old powers adapt to new forms. The most sophisticated science fiction understands that technological advancement doesn't eliminate archetypal patterns, but creates new contexts for their expression. We need mythological stories that help us understand artificial intelligence, genetic engineering, climate change, space exploration, and virtual reality. We need beings that embody the psychological and spiritual challenges of living in an interconnected global system. We need narratives that teach wisdom about power, responsibility, and relationship in contexts our ancestors never imagined. Despite all the technological and social changes that define modern life, certain aspects of existence remain eternal. We still face mortality, we still struggle with power and responsibility, we still need guidance from sources beyond individual knowledge, we still encounter forces larger than personal control. The beings of ancient folklore address these eternal aspects of existence. They provide tested wisdom about how to live with integrity in the face of mortality, how to use power responsibly, how to maintain humility when confronting forces beyond comprehension, how to find meaning in the face of uncertainty. This wisdom doesn't become obsolete because it addresses features of consciousness itself rather than particular historical circumstances. As long as humans possess consciousness, as long as we face choices about how to live, as long as we encounter mysteries that exceed individual understanding, the archetypal beings of folklore will remain relevant guides and teachers. What I'm calling for isn't a return to pre-modern beliefs, but a sophisticated integration of ancient wisdom with contemporary knowledge. We need to become psychologically literate about archetypal patterns, environmentally sophisticated about natural intelligence, technologically wise about the powers we're unleashing. This requires recovering mythological literacy, the ability to recognize archetypal patterns in personal and cultural experience, to dialogue consciously with forces that operate beyond ego awareness, to use traditional wisdom as guidance for contemporary challenge. It means learning to see the goblins in our technology, the fairies in our entertainment, the elves in our environmental systems, the trolls in our institutions, the spirits in our relationship. It means approaching these encounters with the respect, humility, and wisdom that ancient traditions recommend. As we conclude this exploration, I want to leave you with an invitation. Tonight, when you walk outside and look at the shadows between streetlights, when you hear unexplained sounds in your house, when you feel watched by invisible presence, when you encounter technology that seems to have its own agenda, remember what you've learned about the beings that share our world. You don't have to believe in literal goblins, fairies, elves, trolls, or spirits to benefit from their wisdom. You simply need to recognize that consciousness contains depths that exceed ordinary awareness, that reality includes invisible dimensions that affect visible experience, that existence involves relationships with forces beyond individual control. The ancient folklore we've explored tonight isn't museum piece to be admired from distance. It's living wisdom that remains as relevant today as it was thousands of years ago. These beings are still here, still available as guides and teachers, still ready to share their secrets with anyone wise enough to approach them with proper respect.
They wait in the spaces between certainty and doubt, between known and unknown, between seen and unseen. They dance in the liminal places where transformation becomes possible, where wisdom emerges from mystery, where the impossible reveals itself as inevitable. The choice is yours. You can continue living in the flattened reality of pure materialism, or you can step into the fuller reality where ancient wisdom and modern knowledge dance together, where mythological beings serve as guides for navigating the challenges of contemporary existence, where the seen and unseen worlds collaborate in the endless adventure of consciousness exploring itself. The beings of folklore have been waiting patiently for you to remember what your ancestors always knew: that the world is far more mysterious, far more alive, and far more magical than ordinary awareness can perceive. They're ready to resume their ancient roles as teachers, guides, and guardians, if you're ready to remember how to listen to their eternal wisdom. The veil between worlds has never really closed. It's simply been waiting for you to remember that it was always meant to be crossed, that the dance between seen and unseen is the fundamental rhythm of existence itself, and that you've always been invited to join that eternal dance. Welcome back to the living world. The beings of ancient folklore are waiting to greet you.